Hello and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. One day when I was 12 years old, I came home from school and my aunt and both of my grandmas were at my house sitting in the formal living room with my mom. Now, they often came for visits. In fact, my grandparents came to our house every single night after dinner for about half an hour, 45 minutes, just for a visit. It's just the way I grew up. But it was rare to see them there with my mom's sister in the middle of the day. I could tell that they were worried about something. And after I came off the school bus and through the front door and said hi to everyone, I was kind of scooted out of the room. I quickly noticed that the phone, which of course was attached to the wall, was ringing off the hook. It would ring, I would hear my mom answer it, talk for a few seconds, and the conversation was always, yes, we've gone through everything, yes. And then she would hang up, and then it would ring again, and almost that same conversation would take place. My parents were very protective, and scary things were always kept far away from me growing up. And this was a scary thing, a very, very scary thing. This is the case of the Tylenol murders. Let's get into it. In Elk Grove Village, about 20 miles outside of Chicago, a little girl who was my exact same age was having a very different day than I was in small-town Utah. She woke up feeling sick. Instead of beginning her normal morning routine, she went to her parents and told them that she didn't feel well, and her parents decided to keep her home from school that day. Her parents told her to go to the medicine cabinet and take some Tylenol. Just seconds after Mary enters the bathroom, her father heard the door close. Then he heard something fall to the floor. He went to the bathroom door and through it, he said, "Mary, are you okay?" There was no answer. He called again, "Mary, are you okay?" There was still no answer. He opened the bathroom door and later reported, "My little girl was on the floor unconscious. She was still in her pajamas." Her father calls 911 and paramedics arrive at the house. They begin working on Mary and try to revive her. Richard Keyworth, a firefighter and inspector with the Elk Grove Village Fire Department, was there with a paramedic named Dave Spung. Richard said, "Dave was one of the best paramedics I ever met. He threw everything in that drug box at this young lady and nothing made a difference." They put Mary in the ambulance and rushed her to Alexian Brothers Medical Center, but there was nothing that could be done. Little Mary Kellerman was pronounced dead at 9:56 a.m. Edmund Donahue, the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner for Cook County, got a call that there had been an unusual death and a body was headed his way for autopsy. Mary Kellerman's parents were interviewed and the ambulance report was inspected. The only medication listed for Mary was Tylenol. Later that same day, at around noon, a 27-year-old postal worker named Adam Janis was at home in Arlington Heights, which is a suburb of Chicago. He had taken a sick day because he felt like he was getting a cold and needed some rest. He left his home to pick up his children from preschool and stopped at Jewel, which is a supermarket chain in the Chicago area, to pick up some medication. He purchased a bottle of Tylenol and the family headed home. He and his wife made some lunch for them and the children. They ate together, and then Adam told his family, "I'm going to take 2 Tylenol and lie down." About 2 minutes later, he came staggering into the kitchen and collapsed on the floor. His wife called 911 and Adam was rushed to the emergency room of Northwest Community Hospital. At 3:45 p.m., Mary Lynn Reiner, age 27, is at home in Winfield, also a suburb of Chicago. She had just given birth to her 4th child a week earlier. She isn't feeling well, and so she takes some Tylenol. She collapses almost immediately. Now, there aren't a lot of details as to who alerted medical emergency services, but someone calls her husband, Ed, who rushes home from work. He actually gets to the house before the ambulance does. Mary was rushed to Central DuPage Hospital in Winfield, and staff began trying to save her life. Dr. Thomas Kinn is back at Northwest Community Hospital where Adam Janis, the postal worker, had been taken earlier. Dr. Kim is the director of the intensive care unit. Talking about this event, he later said, quote, "Our first job is to resuscitate, and we couldn't even do that. Adam's heart just would not resuscitate. I signed Mr. Janis out as probable cardiac death. I was talking to his family, trying to explain what had happened. That's a hard thing to do even when you have a diagnosis. I was trying to tell them we didn't know why." Adam's wife was there, his parents were there, and a whole slew of other people were there. Those other people were Adam's family members who were in total and complete shock. Adam was in his 20s. He was from a large family of Polish immigrants, and they were devastated at the loss of their family member. They left the hospital and gathered at Adam's house to comfort each other. Now, as we all know, when you sob, when you cry hard, you get a headache. And several of Adam's family members said they had a headache and went to look for something to relieve them. Adam's brother, Stanley, also had chronic back pain and regularly took pain relievers. A bottle of Tylenol was brought from the bathroom, and Adam's brother Stanley, who was 25, and his new wife Teresa, who was only 19, both took some capsules. Stanley started to walk outside to have a cigarette and collapsed before he got to the front door. Moments later, Teresa passed out, dropping onto the floor of the family home. Emergency services were called to the home for the second time that day. Charles Kramer, a lieutenant with the Arlington Heights Fire Department, arrived at the house. He said, "There were cars and people everywhere. All 8 of my men were working, 4 on one man and 4 on a woman. Everything that would happen to the man happened to the woman a few minutes later." So both Stanley and his wife Teresa were experiencing the exact same catastrophic symptoms just moments apart. Back at the hospital, Dr. Kim, who had already spoken to the family about Adam's death, said, "As I was putting on my blue blazer to leave around 5:30, a nurse told me that they were bringing the Janis family back. And I said, well, it's probably the parents because they were old and feeble and, they might be upset. And the nurse said, no, it's his brother and the brother's wife." Dr. Kim continues, "I had just been talking to this 6-foot healthy young guy hours earlier. I asked, what happened? Did they faint? And the nurse said, they're doing CPR. They're working on his wife too." Dr. Kim said, "That's when I took my blazer off. I knew I wasn't going home." Around this same time, a nurse who worked as a liaison between the hospital and the fire department got a phone call. It was Chuck Kramer that I mentioned earlier, who had been at the Janis home. He told Nurse Jensen, "There's something going on here. We had a death this morning, and now we brought in 2 more people from the same house. They want a public health representative here at the hospital, and you're the only public health person I know." Nurse Jensen said, "I dropped everything and went to the hospital." Now, as she headed on her way to the hospital, Deputy Medical Examiner Donahue walks into his office. One of the guys said to him, "Doctor, we've got something unusual going on. We've got 3 family members, the same family. 1 is dead, and the other 2 are not expected to live." So now we've got Dr. Kim, Nurse Jensen, and the EMTs gathered together, and they call in Investigator Pishos to inform him that something strange is happening. Later that same evening, Mary McFarland, age 31, is at work at Illinois Bell, the telephone company. She tells her friends at work that she's got a really bad headache. She went into the back room and took some Tylenol. Minutes later, there was a thump on the floor. Her coworkers went to see what it was, and they found Mary unconscious on the floor. Again, the paramedics are called. Again, there is nothing that can be done. At the time Mary dies, Investigator Pishos and Nurse Jensen are going through the house at the Janis residence looking for any clues that might help them figure out what on earth is happening. Nurse Jensen finds the new bottle of Tylenol with 6 capsules missing. She thought, this has to have something to do with the Tylenol. They all took it. She remembers thinking, there's no seal. It's just an over-the-counter medication with cotton tucked into the top of the bottle. If you're under 35, you probably don't remember that medication bottles didn't used to be sealed. Nurse Jensen bagged the bottle and headed back to the hospital. At 8:15 that evening, Stanley Janis also dies. At 9:30 p.m. at O'Hare International Airport, a United Airlines flight lands coming from Las Vegas. On board is a 35-year-old flight attendant named Paula Prince. She has a headache. After she leaves the airport, she stops at a Chicago Walgreens to buy some Tylenol and then heads back to her hotel. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Nurse Jensen meets with Dr. Kim. She said, "I plopped the bottle down and said, 'This is the cause.' And of course, nobody would believe me. I stamped my feet and they said, 'Oh no, it couldn't be. It couldn't be.'" Dr. Kim later recalled, "Nurse Jensen said, 'Maybe it's the Tylenol.' And I thought, well, that's fine. But at the time, that was just someone saying what they thought. I was very frustrated and I was very desperate. How come I can't figure out what is wrong with these people?" Investigator Pishos then remembered something when he heard Dr. Kim and Nurse Jensen talking about Tylenol. The paramedics had inventoried the bottle of Tylenol from Mary Kellerman's house earlier in the day. It was at the police department. He called and said, "Bring that bottle to me at the hospital." Dr. Kim recalls, "I was pacing in my office. I kept going in my systematic way. What is likely and what is not likely. All medical signs and conditions were pointing to cyanide, but where was the exposure? The only thing I could do was test the patient's blood for cyanide, and I had never done that. I'd never heard of it. We didn't even do that at the hospital. Someone, I think it was another doctor, told me about a lab that does these special tests, so I sent the blood samples away." As Dr. Kim is in his office, Investigator Pishos gets the bottle of Tylenol from Mary Kellerman's house. He compares it to the bottle from the Janis house. The pills have the same control numbers. The investigator called the medical examiner's office and he said, "Look at this. Both Tylenol bottles have the same control number, MC2880. The medical examiner, over the phone, told the investigator to open the bottles and smell them. Pishos opened the bottles and looked inside. He poured them out on the table, and nothing really looked out of the ordinary. Everything was capsules back then. The two pieces that come apart and the powder is in the middle. However, as he was pouring the capsules out of the bottles, he smelled a strong odor of almonds. He picked up the second bottle and smelled it. Same thing, almonds. He turned back to the phone and told the medical examiner, "Both bottles smell like almonds." Now, I'm going to stop here for just a second. I bet a lot of you know that cyanide smells like almonds. But do you know that between 20 and 40% of the human population does not carry the gene required to smell cyanide? Not everyone can smell it. I know this because, as a little girl of 12, I heard it on the news. And to this very day, I still smell every bottle of pills and vitamins I open, and I'm not even sure I'm one of the people who can smell cyanide. That's just the effect that it left on me. I smell pills when I open them. And I have a very, very strong sense of smell. I learned that when I was doing my culinary training. Last week we had Thai food delivered, and my husband set it down on the table, and I said, "Why does it smell like wintergreen?" And he said, "What are you talking about? It smells like garlic and Thai food." And at the bottom of the bag, there was a single wintergreen Lifesaver wrapped in a wrapper and covered in kind of, juice that had leaked out of the food, and I could still smell it. Having a nose like this is a blessing in the kitchen and kind of a curse everywhere else. But just because I have a really strong sense of smell, and if you might have a really strong sense of smell, it doesn't mean that you can smell cyanide. It's a genetic thing. The medical examiner got lucky that day. Lucky that Investigator Pishos is among the percentage of people who can smell cyanide. The medical examiner recalled, "Both Pishos and I said over the phone at the same time, 'It's cyanide.'" Cyanide is a chemical asphyxiant. It blocks your body from using oxygen to oxygenate your red blood cells. You can be in an atmosphere with plenty of oxygen. You're breathing it in, you're taking it in and it's going out. But the oxygen doesn't get picked up by your red blood cells, and so you asphyxiate. It happens very, very quickly, and nothing can be done to save you. September 30th, 1982. At 1 a.m., Dr. Kim got the lab reports back on the blood that he had sent away the day before. All of the patient's samples contained 1,000 times more cyanide than was necessary to kill a human being. At 3:15 a.m., Mary McFarland, the Illinois Bell employee, was pronounced dead at Good Samaritan Hospital. So remember, at this time, Dr. Kim didn't even know that there were additional victims. At 9:30 a.m. at another hospital, Mary Reiner, the new mother, was pronounced dead. She had been at Central DuPage Hospital in Winfield. So we have multiple hospitals involved in a matter of hours, and of course there was no way for doctors to know to put these victims together in such a short amount of time. But as word spreads, the police become more involved. Bill Reiser, who was a sergeant with the Winfield Police Department, said, "We knew Mary Reiner was dead, but I don't think initially we realized until the other investigations came to light with the other towns that we had a connection." About 10 in the morning, Deputy Medical Examiner Donahue is at work. An attorney from Johnson & Johnson, which is the company that makes Tylenol, showed up at his office. There aren't a lot of details on who or how Johnson & Johnson was contacted, but they obviously found out something was going on. The medical examiner took the attorney to the lab, and the office toxicologist explained what had been found. The attorney from Johnson & Johnson stayed for about 90 minutes, and faced with the science and the evidence, he knew what had to be done. He also knew that his client, Johnson & Johnson, had a very serious problem. Roy Dames, who was the CEO of Cook County's medical examiner's office, talked to the CEO of Johnson & Johnson and told him, "We are going to have a press conference." The Johnson & Johnson CEO's reaction was, "Do you have to?" The medical examiner said, "Do you have a better idea?" And the reply was no. Nurse Jensen had gone home to get some sleep the day before, but now we're into the second day. She woke up and was getting ready to go back to work when a special news report came across the television at 10 a.m. Her husband came into their bedroom and he said, "Helen, they're saying it was the Tylenol."
The Cook County Medical Examiner's office here in Chicago has definitely confirmed the presence of cyanide in 2 separate bottles of extra-strength Tylenol. Tylenol capsules, 50 capsules in each bottle, 500 milligram doses.
These have been associated with 1 death in Elk Grove Village and 2 deaths in the serious illness of a 4th in Arlington Heights. 3 victims are related, and onset of symptoms occurred in their family home, but these are 2 different locations, 2 distinct locations.
Dr. Michael Schaefer, the chief toxicologist for the Cook County Medical Examiner's office, and Deputy Chief Examiner Dr. Edmund Donahue are now working to determine how the cyanide got into the capsules. Because of the possibility it somehow was put in during the manufacturing process, Dr. Donahue says,
The only safe course here is that people should refrain from taking extra strength Tylenol, the 500 milligrams capsules. Presently, the medicine, we've only found the medicine in capsules. We think it unlikely that it could be put into tablets. So avoid taking capsules of Tylenol.
A spokesman for McNeil Consumer Products, the manufacturers of Tylenol, has told CNN they are checking for possible manufacturing errors. They're also checking into the capsule's distribution. Police are also checking to see if the cyanide could have been put in at the store where the Tylenol was purchased. I'm Jeff Flock, CNN, at the Cook County Medical Examiner's office in Chicago.
This was on CNN and was quickly picked up by even little towns like where I lived and broadcast by the local news. When I tell you that there could have been a bonfire of Tylenol in the town, I mean that. In that clip, you can see that the medical examiner says, "Don't take this particular 500 milligram capsule of Tylenol." Well, come on. No one was taking Tylenol of any kind. No one was actually taking anything. My dad, oh my hell, this is a memory. My dad was the Iron County prosecutor at the time, and he had a very stressful job. He always had a bottle of Anacin on him. That is such a 70s memory. Anacin, who remembers that? Tylenol was a newer medication, at least to me, but we always had it in the house, and it was what you took if you had a sore throat, a cold, a fever, a headache. You know, it was your go-to for everything. Tylenol was first manufactured in 1955, but it took a while for it to catch on in more rural areas where people continued using aspirin, Anacin, things like that. But let me tell you, no one was taking anything out of their medicine cabinets. And those phone calls that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, those were our neighbors and friends calling to make sure my mom had heard the news and that she had thrown everything out. Before Nurse Jensen left for work, she called the police department and said, "You have got to get the Tylenol off the shelves." She recalled that nobody had really talked to the police about that. And she said, "They told me, oh, we can't do that." And she said, "Oh, yes, you can." She said, "Let me talk to the deputy chief." And by the time she was done with him, he finally said, "Okay, we'll go ahead and do it." So kudos to her. It sounds like she really had to take the leads and kind of, like she said, stamp her feet a little bit, but she got it done. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Johnson & Johnson announced the recall of all Tylenol from lot MC2880, but only from that lot. The medical examiner and other area doctors said they spent the next few days and even weeks taking calls from citizens who were worried that they had taken Tylenol and were going to die. He said his answer to all of them was always the same. "If you're calling me, you're fine. You've got nothing to worry about. But don't take any more." It was scary. It was really scary. At 8 o'clock, the night of September 30th, Tyrone Fauner, the Illinois Attorney General, was at a Republican political event. His aide came up to him and said, "I need you to take a call. There have been poisonings and they're in multiple counties." Now, this fact confused me for a minute, and then I remembered, guys, it did not used to be like it is now. Now something happens and the entire world knows about it within an hour. That is just not the way it used to be. Even though there had been a press conference on CNN that morning, the Attorney General hadn't been told about it. The flow of information just used to be much, much slower than it is now. The Attorney General left the event and headed to his office. He said, "At the time, we didn't know if we had an accident or a set of murders." October 1st, 1982. In a conference room at the Attorney General's office, Fauner gathered the directors from the state police and local law enforcement. He also got the FBI involved. They began a day-long discussion on how to deal with this crisis. At 1:15 that afternoon, Teresa Janis is taken off of life support at Northwest Community Hospital and is pronounced dead. Now, after Paula Prince, the flight attendant from the day before, failed to show up for dinner with her sister and then later failed to show up for work, her family was alerted. They called the police to do a wellness check on Paula. At 5 o'clock on the afternoon of October 1st, police entered her apartment on LaSalle Street. She was there in her home, dead, half in and half out of the closet near her bathroom. There was an open bottle of Tylenol sitting on the vanity. She had taken the pills in the bathroom, and by the time she reached the doorway, she was dead. Police found the receipt from Walgreens, where Paula had purchased the Tylenol. They went to the store and got the surveillance footage from the security cameras. There was Paula purchasing the medication. Unfortunately, there were no cameras in the aisles to see who might have taken the bottles off the shelves and replaced them. I was actually quite surprised to find out that there was even surveillance footage of the purchase. I can promise you that in my little town and most smaller towns in 1982, there wasn't a security camera in sight. I didn't even know security cameras existed until I was in my 20s. So if you're wondering, why they couldn't just go to the stores and pull footage where the Tylenol is sold, look back at the camera footage, it didn't exist. Paula's friend, who was also a flight attendant, said, "This guy just destroyed Paula's life, her dreams, her future. Just poof, one pill. What makes a man do something like that?" That was the question on everyone's mind. At 8 o'clock that night, Jane Byrne, the mayor of Chicago, was preparing for her nightly engagements. Now again, this just goes to show you how different the times were back then. The mayor of the city, did not know about these deaths and the other sick people almost 48 hours after they'd begun happening. As she was coming out of one of her events, the driver of her car said, "There is an urgent message for the mayor to call her office." Now, again, no cell phones. The mayor recalls, "I got to a phone and I listened to the details of what was happening here in my city, and I thought, oh my God, there's 1 million people out there." She wondered, how many others are there going to be? She said, "I called the superintendent of police and the commissioner of the fire department and the doctor in charge of the Board of Health. I told them all to come to the Symphony Center where I was at and meet me in a back room." She told them, "We have to do everything we can. We have to print up flyers, especially in foreign languages, and we have to put them everywhere. We have to notify the public." With flyers. Now, that really shows you and gives you a great sense of just how primitive things were just 35 years ago. The emergency system for a crisis involved putting up flyers. That seems laughable to us now, but back then, that's what they had. The mayor held a press conference informing the public that Paula Prince, the 7th victim, had been found and that she was pulling all of the Tylenol off the shelves in Chicago. She wasn't just going to pull that one batch with that certain control number. All Tylenol was going off the shelves. October 4th, 1982. The City Council of Chicago passes an ordinance requiring tamper-resistant packaging for all drugs sold in Chicago stores as the investigation continues. The following day, Johnson & Johnson recalls all Tylenol products nationwide, not just the 500 milligram capsules. This recall involves 31 million bottles of Tylenol, valued at more than $100 million, which in today's money is $285 million. The entire country is fearful and probably a lot more achy than normal. The manhunt is on for a poisoner and a killer. An information telephone line is established. Attorney General Fonner said they had thousands of calls a day. He said, "We were getting a lot of wackos calling in saying that they did it." There were over 1,200 things that we thought might be genuine leads, not just people calling, but things that seemed plausible, and we went out and investigated each and every one of those 1,200 leads. 100 officers and agents were working overtime. They were drowning in tips and information. One of them said it was like drinking from a fire hose. This frenzy of activity continued for several weeks. It rapidly turned from a Chicago story to a national story and then an international story. Detective Hogberg, working the case, said, "We had a series of people that Johnson & Johnson had fired, and we talked to all of them. One of these people that had been fired earlier had been accused of putting a green mold-like powder in talcum powder, but that lead went nowhere. They talked to store owners and pharmacists and supply companies. They were desperate for a lead of any kind. And then, on October 6, 1982, a letter arrives at the headquarters of Johnson & Johnson. It is an extortion letter. The writer demands $1 million to stop the Tylenol killings. The police are able to trace the letter to James Lewis in New York City. He is immediately taken into custody for questioning. James Lewis was a man who was known to be mentally ill. On top of that, the superintendent of police said not only was James Lewis sick, he was an asshole, an opportunist. He tried to extort some money from Johnson & Johnson, and he went to jail. We looked into everything about his life, but he wasn't even in Chicago around the time of the poisonings. It wasn't him. Now, James Lewis actually ends up going to prison for 13 years for sending that letter. Not only were police unable to prove that James Lewis was the poisoner, they were unable to prove anyone was the poisoner. And as of now, this case remains unsolved. No one knows who poisoned the capsules of Tylenol all those years ago. After James Lewis served his time and was released from prison, he was even dragged back into police custody in 2010 and was forced by a judge to provide DNA samples on the case. They didn't just order James to provide DNA samples, they also ordered his wife, Leanne, to provide them. Lewis admitted that yes, he wrote the extortion letter, but then he said he wasn't the poisoner. But that just goes to show you they're still looking for this person. In 1988, they looked at a woman named Laurie Dan, who poisoned and shot a number of people in 1988 in Illinois, but no connection could be found between her and this case. As late as 2009, police were searching homes, one in particular in Cambridge, Massachusetts, still looking for this killer. I even found an article from just a few months ago talking about how investigators are still following leads on this case, but sadly, nothing has come from any of them. We still do not know who the Tylenol killer is. The aftermath of this event was like an earthquake. New federal laws were put into place forcing companies to completely change the way they package pills. For the most part, companies stopped using capsules that could be taken apart and tampered with and started using caplets that were a solid form pill. Companies are now required to seal the lids with shrink wrap and seal the boxes as well. Now, I'm not going to go into details on this, but I know of a way you could easily still poison medication, and yeah, it's something that I think about once in a while. I'm not going to go into details, and let's probably not do that in the comments either. We don't want to give anybody ideas, but it is still possible to poison products. I mean, don't get me started on, you know what, no, I'm not even going to go into it. We all need to be careful. Now, there were copycat poisonings following this event as well. A woman named Stella Nickel poisoned people and tried to blame medication for that. That's a separate case that we're going to cover. A University of Texas student was poisoned with tampered Anacin capsules. This event, this person, assuming that it was one person, forever changed the way the pharmaceutical industry produces their product. It brought sweeping and important change, and I do think that those changes have prevented further product tampering, but I still think we could do better. 39 years later, the Tylenol murders remain unsolved. We may never know who took the lives of totally innocent people so long ago. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. I sure appreciate you spending time with me. I know you've got a lot of options and it means a lot to me. If you haven't subscribed yet and you'd like to support me, please do that. It helps me a lot. Stay safe and be kind to each other, and I'll see you next time on Dining with Death.